August 1958. Liberal, Kansas. A feed and seed store on Kansas Avenue, a block and a half west of the Seward County Courthouse, where the wheat stubble runs to every flat horizon and the August heat bends the air above the blacktop into something that looks like standing water. The store has been open since 5:30 in the morning, and the register has not moved since 7. That is the injustice. Not a banker, not a padlock, not a notice on the door. It is the register. Nadine Holt has been at the counter since 5:30, and it is now past 9, and 2 men have come in. One for a box of staples and one to use the telephone, and neither of them needed anything from the seed bins or the feedstock or the fertilizer rack along the west wall, and the register has not moved, and Nadine knows without looking at the accounts what that means, because she has been watching the accounts since her father died 4 years ago, and she knows them the way you know a thing you have lived with long enough to fear. The accounts said the same thing yesterday. They will say the same thing tomorrow. A drought year does not fix itself in the space between one morning and the next. Here is the story. The store had been Nadine Holt's for 4 years, and her father's for 28 years before that. Leland Holt had opened it in 1926, the year Nadine was born, and she had grown up behind that counter the way some children grow up in church. It was simply where the family's most important work happened, and you absorbed it by proximity before you understood it by study. Leland had built the store through the dust years, which should have killed it, and through the war years, which almost saved it, and through the lean post-war adjustments, and he had kept it solvent every single year of those 28 by a set of principles that were simple enough to state and hard enough to practice. Sell only what you can source reliably. Extend trade credit only to farmers whose land you would be comfortable holding as collateral, and never let the receivables get ahead of the payables by more than 90 days. Nadine had watched him manage those principles for 20 years before she took the counter herself, and she had followed them faithfully. She was 32 when Leland died. She was not married. She had a younger brother in Wichita who had looked at the numbers and said he wanted no part of it, which was honest of him, and which she had respected in the way you respect a person for knowing their own limits. She kept the full-time stock clerk, a man named Arvis, who had worked for Leland since 1951, and she hired a second part-time hand for the spring and fall rush seasons, and ran the rest herself. The store smelled of wheat dust and cracked corn and the particular sweetness of alfalfa pellets in the bins along the south wall, and underneath it all the sharper smell of fertilizer that came from the bags stacked on wooden pallets in the back section, and underneath even that the older smell of the building itself. Dry timber and dust and decades of outdoor clothing coming in out of the heat. The wooden counter was worn smooth at the edges from 32 years of farmers resting their elbows while they decided. The overhead fluorescent buzzed faintly and cast the kind of light that showed everything equally and flattered nothing. The screen door slapped when it closed. A 2-note sound, a slap going in and a slap going out, loud enough to be heard in the back room. The fan in the corner turned slowly and pushed the heat around without much reducing it. In August, the whole building held the heat from the previous afternoon until nearly 9 in the morning, and then started collecting the new heat, and by 2 o'clock it was stifling, and did not cool again until well after dark. Have you ever known someone who kept a thing going, not because it was comfortable or rewarding, but because it was what the county needed, and what her father had built, and what she understood down to the penny, and who watched it come apart not through any fault of her own, but through a drought year and 60 farmers who owed her money they no longer had? Some of you grew up in towns like Liberal. Some of you walked through a door like this one with your father and knew everyone behind the counter by name. The drought had been building since the summer of 1956. The 1957 wheat crop across Seward County was the worst in 9 years, 20% of normal yield in some sections, nothing at all in others. The farmers who had taken seed and fertilizer on trade credit from Nadine's store, as they did every spring, found themselves in autumn with grain checks so thin that paying the trade accounts was a choice they could not make without leaving something else unpaid. And most of them chose rent over store credit, because the landlord had a lease with teeth and Nadine had a relationship. She understood this. It was the same calculation Leland would have made in their position, and she knew it, and she did not press them. Leland's rule had been that you did not press a man in a bad year, because the land would still be there in the good year, and the man's memory would be there too. Nadine believed this, the way she believed arithmetic. By the summer of 1958, she was carrying $6,200 in outstanding trade receivables, expected to recover $3,800 of it when the harvest came in, was $4,100 behind on supplier invoices, and had $290 in the account against a $380 note payment due September 1st. She had not told Arvis. She had not told her brother. She had not told anyone. Because telling people what the numbers were did not change what the numbers were, and Nadine Holt was not a woman who confused the telling of a thing with the doing of something about it. The county knew the store was struggling the way small counties know things, by the gaps in conversation, by who was slow to make eye contact on the street. Nobody said anything. Nobody knew what to say that would help. You know what that kind of silence means. The kind where people care, but the caring has no handle on it. Where are you watching from? Drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. She was behind the counter on a Tuesday morning in August, going through the receivables ledger for the 4th time, as though looking at the same numbers long enough might reveal something different in them, when the screen doors slapped and a man came in. He was big. He had dust on his boots from the road, and he was carrying his hat rather than wearing it, because the building was low-ceilinged, and he had learned to judge those things. He came to the counter and set his hat down and looked at the store the way a man looks at a place when he is in it for the first time. He said, "I need to ask about seed corn. I've got a property in Arizona, dry land, and I've been having trouble getting the right variety shipped. Man in Dodge City told me you source direct from a hybrid operation out of Garden City." Nadine told him she did. He asked about germination rates and drought tolerance and plant height. He knew what he was asking. She answered without checking a reference, because she had answered these questions for farmers for 4 years and had asked them herself for 20 years before that. He bought 200 pounds of certified seed corn at the commercial rate, $180, and paid cash without remarking on the price. He asked about shipping to Arizona. She quoted him freight. He said that was fine and asked her to write up the invoice. She turned to the filing shelf behind the counter to pull an invoice form. She was in the back for perhaps 2 minutes. When she returned to the counter, he was gone. The invoice book was where she had left it. His hat was gone. The $180 for the seed corn was on the counter beside the ledger she had left open. And next to it was a second stack. She had not heard him count it. She had not heard anything. She stood at the counter and looked at the 2 stacks. She did not touch them yet. She counted them with her eyes. The way a woman counts money she cannot quite believe is there, making sure the denomination is what it appears to be, making sure the number of bills is what it appears to be. Then she touched the edge of the second stack with 1 finger. The way you touch something to confirm it is real. Nadine Holt has not moved. She is standing at the counter of her father's store in August in Liberal, Kansas, and she is looking at $4,000 on a worn wooden counter. And outside the screen door, the heat bends the air above the blacktop into something that looks like standing water. And nothing about this morning is the way it was an hour ago. She stepped to the door and looked both ways on Kansas Avenue. A grain truck was passing 2 blocks down. A woman she knew was on the far sidewalk, not looking this direction. No large man. No dust on the street from a truck pulling out. He had been gone long enough that the street had already forgotten him. She went back to the counter. She put her hand flat on the second stack. She had $4,000 and the $180 for the corn. She had enough to make the September note. She had enough to catch the most urgent supplier invoices. She had enough to get to the harvest. And if the 1958 harvest came in at anything near normal, and the fields she had driven past that July morning said it would, the receivables would recover, and the store would be current before Christmas. She did not cry. She stood there a moment longer with her hand flat on the stack. Then she picked up the ledger and went back to the numbers. The 1958 wheat harvest across Seward County came in at 83% of the 9-year average. Not a good year. Not a bad one. Enough. That was always going to be the word. Enough. Nadine Holt ran the store for 21 more years. She paid the supplier invoices current by November 1958. She paid the September note on time, and every note after it without exception. She recovered $3,760 of the outstanding drought year receivables by the spring of 1959, which was close to what she had projected and enough to clear the last of the backlog. She also put in writing in 1959 what Leland had kept in his head about receivables, how far they could run before a conversation was required, because she had learned that year what happened when they ran too far. Arvis stayed until 1971, when he retired to his daughter's place in Pratt, and Nadine gave him a send-off that involved most of the county's farming families coming through the store over 3 days, which was not a party so much as a recognition, which was the only kind of thing Arvis would have accepted. She hired a young woman named Tamsin in 1969, who had grown up in Liberal and knew the county's farms the way you know a place you have never left, and who was running the store alongside Nadine by 1975. Nadine handed it to Tamsin in 1979, the year she turned 53, because her own hands were beginning to give her trouble, and she trusted Tamsin with the receivables the way she had trusted no one since Leland, which was the highest thing she knew how to say about a person. Tamsin ran it until 1994. Think about what $4,000 left on a wooden counter on a Tuesday morning in August 1958 became. Nadine ran the store from that morning through 1979, 21 more years. Tamsin ran it 15 years after that. Between them, the store on Kansas Avenue served Seward County's farming operations for 36 more years from the morning the screen doors slapped, and a man came in to ask about seed corn. That is 36 more planting seasons. That is the 1959 crop and the 1963 drought, and the good years in between, and the slow years at the end, and through all of them a store that sourced direct and extended fair credit, and did not press a man in a bad year. That is the $6,200 in drought receivables that came back and squared the books when the 1958 harvest settled. And Tamsin learning the receivables well enough to trust them, and a county kept whole through the worst of it, and out the other side. The note on the building and equipment in August 1958 was coming due in 31 days. The man left enough to make it, and enough besides to reach the harvest, and Nadine Holt knew what to do with enough. On the counter of the feed store, it is a farm cooperative branch now, has been since 1996. But it kept the original counter, because the new ownership said the wood was too good to replace. There is a small framed photograph nailed to the wall post above the register. The photograph shows Leland Holt standing in front of the store in 1938, his hand on the door frame, squinting into the summer light. Nadine put it there when she took over in 1954 and said she was putting it there so the farmers would know whose store it still was. And nobody argued with that. The counter below the photograph is the same counter. The worn smooth edges are still there. The overhead fluorescent still buzzes faintly in the same key. The afternoon light from the west-facing window comes across the counter the same way it always did and catches the worn grain of the wood in the late hours of the day. The photograph is still level. Nadine hung it level and nobody has touched it since. If you find yourself in Liberal and walk down Kansas Avenue, the building is the tan brick 1.5 blocks west of the courthouse. The farm cooperative keeps weekday hours. The photograph is above the register on the north wall post. Leland is still squinting into the summer light, the way he always was in photographs, the way his daughter was too when the light came at her straight. Some of you have known a woman who ran a thing alone, by the numbers, through the hard years, without telling anyone how hard, who held the county together with trade credit and fair dealing, and the refusal to let a drought year be the last year. This story is for them. John Wayne never told anyone. Not the store on Kansas Avenue, not the name Holt, not the amount, which Nadine never told anyone either, and which became one of those facts that a small town holds in the way small towns hold things, known by enough people to survive, said by none of them plainly enough to be confirmed or denied. He was in Liberal for less than 2 hours total. He was on the highway south toward Woodward before noon. Nobody who saw his truck on Kansas Avenue that morning knew where it had come from or where it went. And most of them never thought to ask. What is known is what Tamsin found in the back of Nadine's personal account ledger after Nadine died in 2003, a single handwritten page, not dated, not addressed to anyone in particular. A man came in on a Tuesday in August and bought seed corn and left something on the counter, and I never knew who he was for certain, but I know what he saved. And I know what that was worth, and I know it wasn't nothing. A man came through a screen door in Liberal, Kansas, on a hot August morning and asked good questions about seed corn and bought 200 pounds of it and paid his freight, and while a woman's back was turned for 2 minutes, he counted out $4,000 on a wooden counter and put his hat on and walked out through the screen door and was gone before the street had time to notice him. He did not look back. He did not leave a name. He lifted one hand going through the screen door, the way a man raises a hand to answer a question he already knows the answer to, and then the door slapped once and he was on the street, and then he was not. That is most of how it ever got out at all. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There is another one like it every week. And unfortunately, they don't make men like John Wayne anymore.